The first piece of advice my father ever gave me was that a debt unpaid in dollars can be forgiven, but a debt unpaid in dignity gets collected eventually, one way or another. The last piece of advice I gave my daughter was that silence isn't the same thing as peace. She didn't listen to me, and it cost me 4 years in a place where the only thing that belonged to me was my own name. Welcome back to the channel, family. If you've ever been let down by the person you raised with your own two hands, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. Hit that like button before you go, and subscribe if you haven't already. It helps these stories reach the people who need to hear them. My name is Robert Callahan. I'm 63 years old, and until 4 years ago, I owned and ran a small commercial fishing supply company on the Gulf Coast of Texas, about 20 minutes outside Corpus Christi. I built that business from a single bait shop, with a leaking roof into 3 warehouses and a fleet of delivery trucks. 40 years of salt air and early mornings in calluses that never fully softened. My wife Diane died of a stroke 8 years ago. Sudden, no warning. Just gone one Tuesday afternoon while she was watering her tomato plants. Before the funeral even happened, my sister pulled me aside and said the only thing that mattered now was making sure our daughter, Kayla, never felt alone in this world. I took that to heart, maybe too much heart. Kayla was smart, sharper than me in every way that mattered on paper. But she had this hunger in her, this need to be seen as successful, that I think came from watching kids at her private school whose parents drove nicer cars than the ones parked in our driveway. I paid for that school. I paid for her college. I paid for her wedding to a man named Derek Voss. And I paid, without ever saying a word about it, for the down payment on their first house. I told myself I was being generous. Looking back, I think I was just afraid that if I ever said no to her, she'd stop coming around. It was a Thursday, the second week of April, a little after 5 in the evening. Kayla had married Derek 3 years earlier. And Derek was the kind of man who shook your hand a little too hard and called you sir, in a way that felt like a performance rather than respect. He worked in commercial real estate, or said he did, though I noticed the deals he talked about never seemed to close. Kayla had quit her job as a hygienist about a year into the marriage because Derek convinced her she didn't need to work, that he'd take care of everything. I never liked how he talked over her at dinner, finishing her sentences with a different ending than the one she was clearly reaching for. But I bit my tongue because I wanted my daughter to be happy, and because Diane, before she passed, had made me promise I would never come between Kayla and whatever life she chose to build. That evening, Kayla called me in a panic. There'd been a fire in the detached garage behind their house, an old space heater left running too close to a stack of moving boxes. And while the fire department had put it out fast, her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Doris Ann Whitfield, 79 years old, had been standing at the property line trying to help drag a garden hose over when she'd stumbled backward into a low retaining wall. I drove straight over in my truck, an old diesel Ford I'd had since Kayla was in middle school, because I still had a set of bolt cutters and a fire extinguisher in the bed from my warehouse days, and because Kayla sounded like she was one bad breath away from falling apart. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the fire trucks were already pulling out. The flames long extinguished, just smoke and the smell of scorched insulation hanging in the humid evening air. Doris Ann was sitting on her own porch steps 2 doors down, being looked at by a paramedic, holding her wrist against her chest. I walked over to check on her myself. Because I'd known Doris Ann for 15 years, ever since Kayla and Derek moved into that neighborhood. And she used to bring over banana bread every Christmas without fail. She was shaken, scared, confused about what had even happened, the kind of disoriented that comes from adrenaline and age colliding all at once. I knelt down next to her, told her she was safe, that the fire was out, that everybody was fine. The paramedic checked her wrist, said it looked like a minor sprain, nothing broken, and that was that. I thought that was the end of it. I helped Derek clean up the scorched debris in the garage for another hour, drove home a little after 9, and didn't think much more about it until I got a phone call 4 days later from a detective named Ruiz asking if I could come down to the station to answer some questions about an incident involving an elderly woman on Larkspur. Court. I sat in a small gray room across from Detective Ruiz for almost 2 hours before I understood what was happening. Doris Ann, it turned out, had gone to the hospital 3 days after the fire complaining of dizziness and confusion, and her son, who lived out of state and rarely visited, had shown up demanding answers, convinced something more sinister than a stumble had happened to his mother. Somewhere in that chain of panic and grief, and a son's guilt over neglecting his own parent, a story took shape that I had grabbed Doris Ann by the arm during the chaos of the fire and shoved her, hard, into the retaining wall, because she'd supposedly been screaming that I was trespassing on her property with the hose. None of it was true. I had never touched that woman except to help her sit down safely on her own porch steps. But Doris Ann, 80% through what the doctors would later diagnose as the early stages of vascular dementia brought on by a small stroke that same week, unrelated to the fire entirely, told her son a version of events that had somehow reassembled itself into an assault, and her son believed every word of it because it was easier to believe a stranger had hurt his mother than to sit with the fact that he hadn't called her in 6 months. I looked at my daughter across that courtroom 4 months later, waiting for her to stand up and tell the truth about what she actually knew, which was that I had spent that entire evening trying to help, not hurt. Kayla sat in the second row next to Derek, her hands folded in her lap, and when the prosecutor asked Derek, who'd been subpoenaed as a witness, because he'd been the one who called 911, whether he'd seen anything unusual about my behavior that night, Derek cleared his throat and said that I had seemed agitated, and that he couldn't rule out that I might have made contact with Mrs. Whitfield during the confusion. He never said I did it. He was too careful for that. He just left the door open just wide enough for a jury already primed by a grieving, confused old woman's testimony to walk right through it. I turned to look at Kayla. She wouldn't meet my eyes. She stared at a spot on the courtroom floor, like it owed her an explanation, and she said nothing, not one word in my defense, not to the prosecutor, not to her own attorney, not even to me in the hallway during recess. She let her husband plant just enough doubt to bury me, and she let her silence do the rest. If you're still with me, do me a favor and hit that like button. It really does help this channel keep growing. The trial itself moved faster than I ever imagined a man's whole life could be dismantled. My public defender was a good kid, 28 years old, carrying a caseload that would break a mule, and he told me honestly that elder abuse cases involving any hint of dementia-related testimony were almost impossible to win in front of a jury, because nobody wants to be the person who doesn't believe a confused old woman. I refused a plea deal for aggravated assault on a vulnerable adult, because I would not stand up in open court and confess to something I never did, not even to save myself 4 years of my life. The jury took less than 6 hours. The judge handed down a sentence of 5 years with parole eligibility after 4, and as they walked me out of that courtroom in handcuffs, I looked back one last time and saw Kayla crying into Derek's shoulder, and I remember thinking that those tears were for herself, not for me. While I was inside, exactly one person showed up. Not my daughter, not my son-in-law. It was Sam Okafor, my warehouse manager of 19 years, a broad-shouldered, quiet man who had started working for me part-time in college and never left. Every third Saturday, without fail, Sam made the 90-minute drive out to the facility and sat across from me in his work boots and his faded company polo, and he never once asked me if I did it. He just talked to me like a man, told me which drivers were slacking, which clients were paying late, how the new dock equipment was holding up in the humidity. He used to say, "Robert, a man's reputation is like a boat left untied. You can spend your whole life keeping it steady, and it only takes one bad storm and one person who wasn't watching to lose it entirely. But a good boat can be found again, if somebody cares enough to go looking." Kayla and Derek visited exactly 4 times in 4 years, always clustered around holidays, always performing a version of grief and hope for the visitation room camera that I stopped believing in by the second visit. Every single time, they'd talk about how hard things were for them, how the legal fees from supporting me through the trial had drained their savings, how Derek's real estate deals kept falling through, how they were thinking about refinancing the house. Not once did either of them ask me how I was sleeping at night in a 6 by 9 cell with a stranger snoring on the other side of a thin mattress. By the third visit, I stopped answering their letters. By the fourth, I told the guard at intake to tell them I was declining visitation from that point forward, and I meant it. What Kayla and Derek didn't know, what nobody in that family bothered to ask, was that I hadn't spent those 4 years doing nothing but staring at cinder block. I had my company. I still owned 100% of Callahan Marine Supply, and while I sat in that facility, I read every business law textbook the prison library carried, twice through, cover to cover, and then I had Sam bring me updated copies of Texas corporate statutes every visit after that. Because here is the piece Kayla and Derek never understood, never once bothered to check. 2 years before the fire, before any of this happened, Derek had come to me with a business proposal, a request to fold his fledgling real estate consulting operation under the umbrella of my company as a subsidiary, so he could use Callahan Marine Supply's established banking relationships and credit history to qualify for larger commercial loans he couldn't get on his own name. I agreed, because I wanted to help my daughter's husband build something, and because Diane's voice was still in my head telling me not to make Kayla feel like her family didn't believe in her choices. So Derek's little consulting shop, Voss Property Partners, became a wholly owned subsidiary of Callahan Marine Supply LLC, with me listed as the sole managing member and 100% equity holder of the parent company. Derek ran it day to day, made his little deals, collected his commissions, and never once thought to ask what would happen to his precious subsidiary if the parent company's owner decided, for any reason at all, to dissolve the arrangement. The morning I walked out of that facility, a Tuesday in late September, 7:15, the sky the color of wet concrete, I stepped through the gate, carrying a small cardboard box with my watch, my wedding ring, and the wallet I hadn't touched in 4 years. I was 63 years old, 22 pounds lighter, my hair gone from salt and pepper to mostly white, but my hands were steady, and my mind was steadier still. Sam was parked at the curb in his own truck, engine running, a thermos of black coffee waiting in the cup holder, exactly the way I used to drink it at the warehouse every morning at 5 a.m. He didn't ask me how I was feeling. He just leaned over, pushed the passenger door open, and said, "Where to first, boss?" I told him the courthouse annex, to file the paperwork my lawyer had already prepared and waiting, and then the warehouse, because I had a company to see about. By 11 that morning, the documents were signed, notarized, and filed with the Texas Secretary of State. I hadn't sued my daughter or her husband for anything. I hadn't called the police to report a single thing, though God knows I had grounds to. I simply exercised my lawful authority as the sole owner of the parent company, and formally dissolved the operating agreement that allowed Voss Property Partners to exist as a subsidiary, effective immediately, along with revoking every line of credit and banking authorization that had ever been extended to Derek under my company's name. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, I had Sam drive me to the house on Larkspur Court, the same house where the garage fire had started 4 years earlier. The house I had quietly co-signed the mortgage on and never once mentioned again because I didn't want Kayla to feel like she owed me anything for it. It was a warm, bright afternoon. Hydrangeas blooming along the front walk, a leased luxury SUV, and Derek's company car both parked in the driveway, like nothing in the world had changed. I didn't knock. I walked up that path with a copy of the dissolution paperwork in a manila folder tucked under my arm, because some things a man needs to say to your face, and some things you simply need to be handed. Kayla answered the door herself. She looked older than 4 years should have made her look, tired in a way that makeup couldn't quite cover, and for 1/2 of 1 second, before she caught herself, I saw something in her face that might have actually been relief to see me standing there alive and whole. Then Derek appeared behind her in the hallway, phone still in his hand, and his expression shifted the way a man's expression shifts when he realizes the ground under his feet has changed without his permission. "Dad," Kayla said, her voice catching, "you're out. Why didn't you call us? We would have come to pick you up. We would have." "I don't need picking up anymore, Kayla," I said, my voice even, quiet. The same voice I used to use on a warehouse floor full of men twice my size when something needed saying plainly. And you don't need to visit me anymore either. Not that you were making much of a habit of it. Derek stepped forward, that same performance of confidence sliding back over his face like a coat he kept by the door for occasions, just like this one. Robert, look, I know things got complicated at the trial, but that's behind us now. We've been praying for this day. We want to move forward as a family. I'm not angry, Derek, I said, cutting him off. And I meant it. Because anger requires expecting something from a person, and I had stopped expecting anything from either one of them somewhere around the second missed visitation. I don't hold anger for people. I've stopped counting on. I opened the folder and handed the first page to Kayla directly, not to Derek, because this was between a father and his daughter first, and everything else was just paperwork underneath that. This is formal notice that as of 9 o'clock this morning, Voss Property Partners has been dissolved as a subsidiary of Callahan Marine Supply, I said. Every credit line, every banking authorization, every commercial relationship that company used to close deals for the last 2 years, gone, effective immediately. Derek's business doesn't exist on paper anymore. It never really existed without mine underneath it. Derek's face went the color of old chalk. You can't do that, he said, his voice climbing an octave. Those deals are already in escrow. I've got 3 closings pending. If those financing lines get pulled, I'm ruined. I'm completely ruined. You were always borrowing my ground to stand on, I said. I just decided I wanted it back. Kayla was staring at the paper in her hands like it might rearrange itself into something less final if she looked hard enough. Dad, this house, she started. The mortgage, we can't. The house isn't touched, I said, and I watched something like hope flicker across her face before I finished the sentence. That's yours, free and clear of me, because you're still my daughter and I'm not interested in punishing you for a roof over your head. But everything Derek built standing on my name and my credit, and 19 years of Sam Okafor's sweat in my warehouses, that's finished today. Derek's hands were shaking now, his phone buzzing uselessly in his pocket. Probably some broker already calling to ask what in God's name had happened to his financing. Dad, please, Kayla said. And for the first time in 4 years I heard something real crack through in her voice. Not performance, not guilt management, just fear. Give us some time. Give us a few months to figure this out. Don't do this to your own family. I gave your husband 2 years of my credit and my company's good name, I said. And when I needed 5 seconds of honesty from you in that courtroom, you gave me silence instead. I've had 4 years to think about what family actually costs, Kayla, and I've decided I'm not interested in paying that particular bill anymore, not for people who won't pay it back. If this story is hitting close to home for you, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who needs to hear tonight's message. I turned and walked back down that path into the warm afternoon light, and I didn't look back at the house, because there was nothing behind that door that belonged to me anymore. By 6 that evening, back at the warehouse office that still smelled like diesel and salt water exactly the way I remembered it, my accountant had the final numbers ready. Derek's pending deals collapsed within the week, once word got out in the small, gossiping world of regional commercial real estate that Voss Property Partners had lost its financial backbone overnight. I heard through an old family friend, months later, that Derek lost his position at the brokerage entirely once his broker's license came under review for some of the funding irregularities, the sudden dissolution exposed, corners he'd apparently been cutting the entire time using my company's credit as cover. As for the trust I set up, I didn't put a single dollar of company equity into anything for myself. I signed over 15% ownership stake in Callahan Marine Supply directly to Sam Okafor, effective that same week. The first real ownership he'd ever held in 19 years of showing up before sunrise and never once asking me for anything except the truth. He earned that stake sitting across from me in a visitation room every 3rd Saturday for 4 years, asking about drivers and dock equipment, instead of asking me to perform forgiveness I didn't feel yet. I still live in the same house I've lived in for 30 years, the one Diane and I bought back when Kayla was still in diapers, out past the edge of town where you can smell the Gulf on a good wind. Every morning at 5, I drive to the warehouse, pour myself a cup of black coffee, and stand on the loading dock with Sam, while the first trucks pull out for their routes. Same as I did for 4 decades before any of this happened. I heard, secondhand, through the kind of small-town grapevine that never really stops talking, that Kayla and Derek sold the Larkspur courthouse within the year. Once the mortgage without my quiet backing became too much for one income to carry, and that they moved into a rental across town. I don't know if Derek found other work in real estate, or if he had to start over doing something with less shine to it. I don't ask, and nobody's offered to tell me more than that. I don't carry hatred for my daughter in my chest, not really, because hatred takes up room a man my age doesn't have space for anymore. Not after 4 years of learning exactly how much a person can carry and still wake up standing the next morning. I simply stopped propping up a life built on my back and my name, and I let her find out what her own 2 feet could hold without me underneath her. Thank you for spending this evening with me. Take care of the people who show up for you when everything else falls apart. And I'll see you, my friends, in the next story.